Hi, everybody. My guest today is Jason, who is a new friend that I met through our mutual respect, admiration, and learning from the Shipibo people, specifically working with the master plants, ayahuasca and tobacco. Now, Jason has a very interesting background, and I'll be posting about that in the notes. But primarily, what you need to know is that he has been living and working in the Peruvian Amazon for the past decade, and he works facilitating plant medicine ceremonies with Shipibo doctors. And after a long initiatory process, he's been working with the master plant tobacco for learning and healing. Now, he also recently started the Universe Within podcast, which is designed to give voice to the doctors, shamans, guides, teachers, and wisdom keepers that are working with plant medicines and spirituality. So we have this in common, which is quite wonderful and very much what my particular program is about as well, and why I brought him on to the program. Now, usually our focus is on centering the voices of women that are embodying feminine wisdom and are interested in changing the human story, as so many stories of women have been suppressed, especially the healers, the doctors, the mystics, the goddess. So we're bringing all of this forward. And what I love about the conversation with Jason is that he speaks about this cosmology of the ayahuasca plant and one of the stories and how it was birthed with the masculine and the feminine inherent within it, which is inherent within all of us, and how this plant really does birth a new life, a new way of living for all of us that are able to take it up responsibly. So you're going to learn a great deal in this conversation, and especially the reconnection to ourselves, to each other, and to our great Earth Mother. So I'm very happy to bring this to you. I hope you enjoy it, and I really would love it if you would subscribe to this channel, like, share if you want, if you do, and then go over to my website, which is prajnaohara.com, and click on podcasts. You can learn more about the podcast that is emerging and how you can contribute and participate. There's a way there that you can make a donation and listen to earlier conversations. Many have already happened and many are still coming forward. So enjoy this conversation with Jason, and you can learn more about him in the notes and also at his website, which is called nicotianarustica.org. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy.
Welcome to the womb, a place to slow down, connect, and reflect.
So I'm looking to see what we can explore together to really honor the intelligence of the plants and what is involved in working with the plants and learn from him. So I'm going to go right away to letting Jason tell us about a little bit about your biography, like what brought you to plant medicine, what were you doing before plant medicine, and eventually we'll just build upon that. So go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Prajna. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I could go on for a while, but long story short, I was living in New York. I grew up in the U.S., although I've had kind of an interesting life. I was born in Sri Lanka, and my parents were traveling quite a bit when I was very young. But then we moved back to the States. I grew up a lot in Virginia, and then I moved to New York City for a long time. I was living there for about 11 years. And at some point, I just became really interested in plants. I think a lot started from a more dietary point of view. I started giving up kind of meat and some other things, and just I found myself eating obviously more plants, and then I just kind of started thinking, like what are plants? Why are we taking them in? What are they doing? And that kind of led to an interest in herbalism and herbal medicine, using plants as remedies for various ailments. I got interested in a lot of traditional medicines, like traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, European herbalism, American herbalism. And that really, I think, is what started it. And I had a teacher in New York who was really influential with me, and he also worked with a lot of kind of stronger plants we would call master plants.
Mm.
But at that time, I actually never had a desire to work with them. I think I was kind of this mindset that everything I needed was inside me, and there was no real reason to reach out and to look outside of myself. But um, I was actually doing a yoga training at the time. I was teaching a bit of yoga as a part-time job, and I was in Colorado, and something just kept coming up. I'd heard of ayahuasca before.
Mhm.
A good friend of mine was part of the Santo Daime Church. But one of the interesting things about Santo Daime, it's a Brazilian church that also works with ayahuasca. But one of the things that I really respect about that church is they don't kind of evangelize the church. So there's a rule, which is you can never kind of coerce or draw someone into the church. They have to come from their own free will. So even though I had this friend who was, according to him, ayahuasca really kind of saved him. He was having a lot of issues. There was never kind of a pressure to come in, but I had known about ayahuasca. And when I was doing this training in Colorado, it just kept coming up, the word ayahuasca, and there was something about it that I got really curious about, and I started doing some research, and it kept filling my mind somehow. And it very much, and this may sound kind of weird to people who haven't maybe worked with plants, but it very much felt like I was somehow being called. I didn't know exactly why or how, but I just felt this urge that I actually really needed to work with this plant. So I started looking up some places, and I really wanted to go to the Amazon, where this plant is from, and work with people who had been working with it for a long time. And I actually was going to another retreat, and in the kind of last minute it was canceled, and I had signed up for this other retreat, and I was on the waiting list, and it was at a place called the Temple of the Way of Light. And so I went there for a workshop, and it was incredible. It was literally awe-inspiring, and it really kind of confirmed a lot of things that I had felt, almost like a different way of looking at the world that I had sensed, but I had never necessarily had a direct experience of that.
Mm.
And so that was a really transformative experience. And kind of serendipitously, the owner was also facilitating at that time that workshop I was in, and he was looking to start a second center that was kind of a longer term center, where they were adding various integrative practices, complementary practices, things like yoga and meditation and martial arts, things like that. So he knew a little bit about my background, because I practice a lot of those things, and he thought I would be a really good fit to come back. And I was actually looking to get out of New York at the time, and I didn't know how or why or where, and it just fit. And so I ended up coming down to the Amazon to work at this center. And that really started this kind of path of really, going quite deeply into this work. But I guess, long story short, it was really just a genuine curiosity. It's something I've always found very fascinating. Shamanism and ancient cultures and different ways of looking at the world. And when I worked with ayahuasca for the first time, it kind of really opened me up experientially to all of these things.
Mm. Well, so that's quite a bit right there. So let's see if we can unpack that. There's a couple of things that you said that are really interesting to me. And that is, you said at one point that you thought everything was inside of yourself. And that's a very curious thing, because usually most people in life, they're searching for something, or there's some great suffering or some illness or something like that brings them to plant medicine or brings them onto a spiritual path. So it sounds like for you, there was a curiosity, but But was there something in particular, a life experience that you were maybe looking to remedy or heal? Or was it more just really a curiosity of finding out about the medicinal properties of the plants, about the indigenous people and, who have made these amazing plants available to us, or something else?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think ever since I was quite young, again, I had an interesting life where I was traveling quite a bit, especially with my father, and he was very interested in different cultures from all over the world. So I spent a lot of time in India and just all throughout the East, and even I was in Peru when I was quite young. And there was just something fascinating about these places. There was something even very young where I felt, I mean, people are people. That's also something I realized. Wherever I went, human beings are human beings, and we're all the same. But certainly, we are a product of our time, of our cultures, and just seeing some of these ancient sites like Machu Picchu. I mean, there's something there that really drew me. Just this awe, this curiosity. And so, after I graduated university, I moved to New York, and I just got very curious about religion and spirituality, and I was just devouring, all the books I could find, and just really learning. And I really kind of saw that all of these paths were pointing to something very similar, and saying it in different ways. And I got very interested in things like yoga and Tai Chi and Qigong and martial arts. And so there was always this very kind of deep longing, this longing to experience something else that I sensed existed, but I hadn't necessarily experienced what I felt was there. And I think, like you said, I mean, it's a very common practice where in this path, a lot of people do come to it through some form of suffering. I mean, especially in that world of shamanism, that's a very common archetype. A lot of people would even say that the path of the shaman is a path of suffering, because it's this path of deprivation, of isolation, of really going inside, and ultimately coming to terms with death, which is something we all share in common as humans. So there was a point where I was. It was almost this existential thing where I almost felt, and I think that was part of the need to get out of New York too, was there was almost this existential suffering of, I mean, sometimes I would just be walking down the street and I would be like overcome by this almost like awe of even just the sky or the buildings of New York. They seemed almost like too much. Like I couldn't comprehend sometimes these things that I was experiencing. And so sometimes it could feel very overwhelming. And so I think there was also something in me that was trying to really to find peace, which I think is something we're also all really looking for, is this sense of peace, of harmony, of connection, of a sense of really embodying ourselves and life. And so that was definitely a huge part of it too. So it was this longing of something greater than myself, but also this really deep desire to understand plants and healing and medicine, and how these people actually worked with that. Because the way that these plants are worked with here in the Amazon, or even in Peru, it is a very different way of medicine. I mean, for me, all medicine is based in the same thing, but this is also a system that's very different. It's very different from kind of an allopathic system, where if I have a symptom, I take a particular pill, and that kind of maybe cures the symptom, and if we're lucky, maybe gets to the root of the problem, but maybe not. And the way that they're working down here, it's very much, it's a holistic system. So they're not just working on the physical. And I think a lot of the medicine that we're familiar with is only working on this physical layer. It's this kind of way of saying, if there's a problem, it's because something is out of balance. There's a chemical imbalance, or you have too much of this or not enough of that. And I think that's certainly true. But what we maybe also don't understand is the other layers that come with that. the potentially emotional imbalance or the mental imbalance or the spiritual imbalance. And I think for a lot of people, that's almost maybe like a kind of a woo-woo concept. How could I be spiritually imbalanced? Um, and yet I actually, on my podcast 2 days ago, I was interviewing a guy who I know. His name is Joe Tafur, and he's an interesting guy because he's a medical doctor, but he's also trained in the Shipibo system. And
Mm-hmm.
he was saying there's this, I forget who it was. It was a guy from Africa. Maybe he's a curandero, I'm not sure. But he was saying a lot of the ailments that we suffer from, that three of the main reasons, and I'm not sure if I can actually remember them, but one was a lack of community. Um, Two was a lack of faith, and yeah, and the third was a lack of nature, that we've lost connection to nature. But I think there's a huge aspect with that, which for me is also very true, which is this lack of faith. We've kind of lost faith. We've lost this idea of awe, this potentiality of there's things that we don't know, that we can't understand, that literally the mind has a limit. The mind can only understand things. That's the nature of the mind. It can potentially understand everything, but it can never understand what's beyond a thing, what's beyond form and name.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really where spirituality comes in, because it's an experiencing of something that often can't even be put into words, or it's not tangible, and yet there's a very direct experience of that. And I think a lot in the cultures we're coming from, we've lost touch with that, and we think that the answers to all of our problems is just more mind. Well, if I just know more, if I have more, if I understand more, then I'll be happy. And I think what we're seeing is that that's not the case. We're suffering now from a lot of ailments: anxiety, depression, disconnection, loneliness, just all sorts of things that are more of this, what we may call mental issues. But the root of that can also be seen as a spiritual issue, that we've lost this connection. Um, so yeah, that was certainly part of my path that brought me down too, was this kind of longing, this search for something, again, that and again, it's hard to put into words, but
Mm-hmm.
something that I sensed was out there, that I didn't have an experiential, not even knowledge of, but I hadn't experienced that. Um, so yeah.
That's beautiful. I love the way that you put all that together. Yeah, so let's go to your first ayahuasca experience. So, like, I love what you're saying, because in a sense, we've really, if we just go by our conditioning in our modern cultures and in so many cultures, we're really looking at consuming and more like we're objects. And would you say that when you meet ayahuasca, you're the subject? You really come into a subjective experience with everything about yourself. And I love what you're saying about connection. And that reminded me of a term that I heard from The Lost Intelligence of the Plants. I think it's a book by Stephen Bruner. And he speaks
uh,
about biophilia, and which is our natural connection to nature, and how there has become this disconnect. And in children, it's actually quite natural. But these days, because we go onto the computer so early, and there's this disconnection, and we forget, or we lose this sense of feeling, the feeling sense of who we are, that we're a sensing organism that naturally is connected to all things, and then it gets covered over. And you were talking about the layers and getting to the root. And in my experience with ayahuasca, and I want to hear about your first experience and how that may have evolved, but it's kind of like a peeling these layers back and really feeling, and you're being magnified as the subject of life, and how you are in relationship perhaps to all parts of life, and how can that harmonize and integrate, and like you use the word, be embodied. So let's go back to the beginning of what your first experience was like with ayahuasca, and how that may have progressed over time. And I heard you on one of your podcasts. This might be nice to hear for the people who are listening for the first time, and they can go and listen to your podcast on ayahuasca as well. But you told a story of the mythology of these two parents that requested to be buried by a tree. Could you like give us that story again and then go on with your experience?
Yeah, I think you said that very well. I think these medicines are very subjective. I mean, they're 100% subjective. Everyone is going to have a different experience when they work with them because every human being is unique. They're completely unique. You know, no two human beings are the same, and therefore no two human beings will ever have the same experience. So it's incredibly subjective, and it's incredibly personal. And but I think there are certain archetypes that these plants can bring out. You mentioned this idea of connection. I think that's a huge one. Uh, for me, some of those early ayahuasca experiences, one thing that I really remember that stood out was this idea that maybe a lot of the anger, the resentment, or the judgment of other people that I had, it was this very, again, embodied experience where I actually saw myself in those people's shoes, and I realized that everything they were doing, I had also done myself.
Mm.
And so to hold on to that was literally insanity, because I was I was doing the exact same things that I was asking other people not to do.
Mm.
And I think that's for me, from what I've seen, that can be one of the fundamental archetypes of this work, is really seeing things from the other side. And I think from a Buddhist point of view, that's actually one of the definitions of wisdom, is it's actually putting yourself in someone else's shoes, seeing things from the other side. And that's that idea of balance, or the middle way, is, when we're holding on to something, we're moving towards an extreme. But when we go to the other extreme, then we can actually find balance. And so many of these things that we're holding on to, they're actually causing us suffering. That's another Buddhist terminology. And we don't often see it that way. We so identify with our mind. We think that everything that I think is true. How do I know that? Because I'm thinking it, therefore it must be true.
Mm.
But it's a very different experience when we begin to detach from that, and we begin to see things from a different point of view. And I think one of the things that really arises from that is a sense of compassion, a sense of understanding, a sense of wisdom. And in that way, we free ourselves. We move closer to a state of peace, of wholeness, of balance.
Mm.
Um, and then one of the other just really big things for me was, and I don't think I really realized this until I started working more as a facilitator and with other people's experiences. But again, because the experience is so subjective, it can be very difficult to really know or understand what someone else is going through. But I think over time, I developed a better sense of that. But what I didn't realize is my experiences in the beginning were huge. I mean, I couldn't even comprehend them. I mean, I was in other universes and talking to other things and seeing things, and it was completely overwhelming. But I managed to hold myself very well. It's something I joke about, that one of the reasons probably Matthew hired me is because I sat there the whole ceremony just kind of in this meditative state, and so many other people were screaming and yelling and crying, and I think they were just like, wow, this guy's really, he's really centered. But little did they know, I was just completely blown away, 24/7. I mean, I was just in other places. And I think it took me a while to realize that that's not everyone's experience. Not everyone has these just crazy otherworldly experiences. But I think that was very important for my process, because that was actually something I was looking for. This sense of these other ways of being, these other realms, these other access to things that again, I sensed were there, but I didn't have a direct experience of it. And that gave me that. And in the most profound way. And I think that was that was also one of the things that led me to come back, because it opened me to this other world. And I was just left with even more questions and more of a desire to really go into that and to begin to try and understand that.
Mm.
Um,
What I like about this story that you told, I had never heard it before, for one, and I think it's a great story, and I know there are many. But what I like is it kind of represents both archetypes of the masculine and the feminine, in a sense, mother, father, this possibility of balance where it's not really just a masculine energy or feminine energy, but both
mm,
can be activated. And like you said, how true is it? And also, we all experience ayahuasca differently. But go ahead and tell that story.
yeah, well, that's one of the reasons I really like this story, and I think it was probably to some degree why I was originally drawn to working with Shipibo, even though I didn't know it at the time. But it was this idea of balance, and even the Shipibo within the Amazon jungle, they're very well known for having a real mastery over this particular plant of ayahuasca, and it's used by many different groups, many different people, but the Shipibo are known for really having a mastery over that plant. Um, and sometimes when people work with ayahuasca, there's often this idea that potentially ayahuasca is a feminine spirit, or it's anthropomorphized as a woman. And again, I think there's many different reasons for that. There are some cultures who do believe that. There's some like the Tubu who I've worked with who would say all of these plants embody the feminine because they're actually they actually originated from the stars, which is more of this kind of masculine quality, but they're embodied here on the earth, which is this more feminine quality. And it's almost this idea of the mother, that it's in a way maybe helping us even to give birth in an archetypical way. But the story that I've heard many times by different Shipibo is that in old times, the Shipibo actually lived in family units, kind of dispersed throughout the jungle. So this is a really long time ago. This is actually even before they were in communities, and potentially the more we learn about the Amazon, there's potentially even civilizations and many people living there. So I think the idea of this was really ancient times. They were living in these family units. And there was a particular family that was very connected to nature. They just had a deep understanding, a connection to nature, to the natural cycles. And one day, the father first, in a premonition, in a dream, which I think is very symbolic, because a lot of this work, I think the closest quality that it can be described to is actually dream work. It's in a sense entering us into a dreamlike state, and that's where a lot of this work is done, and individually, and also on the more shamanic level, the level of the curandero, the doctor. That's also where they're doing their work, is in this dream state. So in this dream, the father had a premonition that he was going to die soon. So he told his wife and his children, don't, I don't know how they did it at the time, but don't dispose of my body in the traditional way, whether that was burying or, but to actually place my body at the base of this particular tree. And they all thought he was crazy because he was still young and healthy. And they're like, no, husband, father, you're not going to die. Sure enough, he did. And so they honored his wish and they put his body at the base of this tree. Some time passed, and then the mother, also in this dream, had a similar premonition that she too was going to die. So she told her children, and there's different versions. Some say at the base of this same tree, some say in the center of their house. But either way, to place her body there as well. So she died just as her premonition said, and the children honored her wish. So then, because the children had no family, no parents, they went off to distant relatives, and they spent time with them, and they lived for many years. And then also the children, when they were adults, they also had this premonition, this dream, that they needed to go back to these places where they had laid their parents to rest. And from where they had laid their father was this vine growing up this tree. And from where they had placed their mother was this beautiful bush growing out of the ground.
Mm.
And they also, through this dream state, they were told that they needed to combine these plants almost as a sacrament and ingest that. And I think that story is symbolic in a lot of ways. Again, the dream space, I think questions even from the outside world, like where did this knowledge come from? How did they know to combine these two plants? And that mythology really answers it. It was actually, interestingly, it's almost this Christian ideal too, that it's a sacrament. It actually comes from the body of these very knowledgeable people. And also that the knowledge came in the dream space. So it was through that dream space that the knowledge, something taught them what they needed to do. And so, I think even as something like ayahuasca becomes more studied in a more Western point of view, that story has a lot of symbolism. The Shipibo would say that the ayahuasca vine, where the father came from, represents the masculine quality, and that masculine quality is that which gives the effect. It's they in Spanish they say the mareación. It's that which gives the dizziness, that which allows one to enter the space. Or in a sense, it's that which holds the space, that which allows the feminine, which is the plant is called chacruna, or in Shipibo kawa. It allows the feminine to work, and it's very similar to a Chinese metaphor of yin and yang. It's the exact same symbolism. So the feminine is that which gives the light, or that which gives the vision. And the feminine can't work without the masculine. The masculine is needed to allow the feminine to work. But the masculine has no light. It has no vision without the feminine. So there's a symbiotic relationship to the two. They're both essential. One without the other is incomplete. It doesn't work. So it's only through the combining of the two polarities that ayahuasca, or in the Shipibo, they call it uni. It's only through the combining of the polarities that uni, or knowledge or wisdom, is allowed to be birthed. So yeah, and even in a more kind of scientific way, that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
Exactly what the Shipibo have said. The ayahuasca vine, the masculine, contains an alkaloid called monoamine oxidase, the inhibitor of that, because we have this enzyme in our stomach, which normally, if we were to ingest any substance that contains DMT or dimethyltryptamine, this enzyme in our stomach inhibits that. So that's what they're saying. If you were just to take chacruna, the feminine, it would have no effect. But through the ayahuasca vine, it contains this alkaloid that inhibits this enzyme in our stomach, which then when we ingest the chacruna, or the kawa plant, it allows the DMT to be active. And also the ayahuasca vine has many alkaloids itself, many alkaloids, harmine, harmaline. So again, that's kind of a reductionist way of looking at it, but it is exactly what the Shipibo were saying. And I think it's also fascinating because this point that you brought up in the beginning, where I was saying that I thought that I didn't need anything that was outside of me. The fascinating thing about ayahuasca, or these alkaloids like dimethyltryptamine, is that it's actually something that's endogenous to ourselves. We produce it. It's thought that potentially our lungs or our liver, or some people say parts of the brain, actually produce this substance. And some people would say it's when we go to sleep at night, we have a surge of DMT. Some people speculate that when we're born and when we die, there's a massive surge of DMT. And so it also makes sense that it's inducing that dream state, or it's inducing that birth state, or the dying state. But that also, it's not that we're, and this is kind of something that's very interesting, it's not that we're even necessarily taking in something from the outside. It's that this thing that we're taking in from the outside is turning on something that's already there.
Yeah.
It's almost like we have a keyhole in our brain or in our bodies that's waiting for the key to enter it and turn it on. So, yeah.
Wow, that's such a beautiful way to put it. And that really, in a way, kind of indicates that taking ayahuasca is essentially safe. There isn't anything harmful about it. But then there may be something about creating a certain environment, or like the Shipibo they have a particular ritual. You mentioned another tradition that I'm not familiar with, but I am familiar with Quechua, and I've sat in that tradition for a number of years, and then with the Shipibo, and there's differences, but essentially, it's the same. The medicine is the same, but there are elements within that ritual that seem to be very important. That about how they create the space with smoke or prasanga, with protection, with the Icaros. And also, like you said, you became at one point a facilitator, and there are other facilitators. So there's something about, even though this is natural to us in our bodies, there's something about how this is administered so that a person can really benefit from it in a way of perhaps not having too much of a dose, or all of these things that are kind of attended to or cared for in a responsibly held ceremony. So maybe say a little bit about that, like what makes, what is a ceremony, first of all? What are the elements of that? And what really gives it kind of a structure or a feeling of safety, so a person can know that if they come to this particular place, that they can relax and they're going to be taken care of. Like, for instance, the Temple of the Way of Light is very reputable. And you know that, I know that. But I know that there are situations of people who haven't had such a positive experience, especially as the medicine is becoming so widely available in the West, that maybe we can just speak about some context for that and some pointers, and which can guide a person's journey so that they can really receive all that you've been speaking about so far, this this ability to see who you are truly, and into different realms, and experience much more of what's available to us.
Yeah, it's as you were saying, ayahuasca itself is safe in the way that it's working with something that is already inside of us. Having said that, one of the earliest recorded Western physicians was a guy, I think his name was Paracelsus, and he said it very beautifully, which is that the difference between a medicine and a poison is in the dose.
Mm.
And the stronger the medicine, the stronger the potential toxic aspect of it, the more it can be a poison. And that may sound strange at first, but if we think of anything, we know that. I mean, when you go to the doctor and you take pharmaceutical medicine, it's very clearly written on there, what's the dose, how often you take it, because it's known that if you take too much, it can kill you. The medicine can become a poison.
Mm-hmm.
So the dose is extremely important. Just like a pharmaceutical medicine, they may say, don't drink alcohol or don't mix it with this other pharmaceutical because it could turn into a poison. It could actually kill you.
Mm-hmm.
So any strong medicine, there's the medicine aspect of it, but there's also the opposite of that, which is if we're taking something that's really having an effect on us, we have to be very careful, because that the line between a medicine and a poison is a very, very fine line. So that's where I think really working in a system that really creates a safe environment is super important. In general, it would be very difficult to die from drinking ayahuasca, because one of the things that ayahuasca does is it very often induces a purge, a physical purge, which one of the most common forms is vomiting. So, I think if someone started drinking too much, they would begin to induce their own purge. It's the body's kind of natural mechanism of clearing that. So I think physically there's not a danger to it, but what the danger would be is these medicines like ayahuasca are very much opening us up to things that we may or may not be ready for. And if the dose is too strong, if we're taking too much, if there's no one there to guide that, we might not be able to handle that. Um, and so that's very important. There are certain conditions that are counterindicated for ayahuasca. So, it's not that necessarily anyone can take it, but the vast majority of people can. But there are certain conditions that one would need to be mindful with that. So then with that, as you said, it's from my point of view, it's vital to be in a place where that work is being done conducively. We often use the analogy of open heart surgery.
Mm.
You wouldn't want to just cut your heart open and start operating on it. Maybe even you watched a YouTube video, or there's some guy who, has a training of 1 month of how to do open heart surgery. It's probably not the best idea.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to have open heart surgery, you want to make sure you're in an environment that's really conducive to that, that you're in a clinic. The person who's operating on you has a lot of experience. They've done that before. There's a whole team that's supporting them. If anything were to go wrong, they know how to deal with that. So it's the same thing with a plant medicine like ayahuasca. You want to be in an environment where they know what they're doing, and they know how to manage that space. And because also what we're doing is we're opening ourselves to spaces that a lot of us are unfamiliar with, very kind of uncharted territory. And it's very vital to really have a guide to help us through that. So yeah, this work is traditionally done in a ceremonial context, and I could probably talk for hours about that, but I think just really basically that ceremony is very important, because it's when one is working with these plants, it is opening us things that again we may not be used to, and the ceremony is really vital to that, because it's not just like we sit down and we drink and we go about our lives. It's a very specific time and a place, and there's an intention behind it from the participant, from the people working. It's, a ceremony is also not something we would do every day. It's not possible. The body couldn't take it, the mind couldn't take it. It's something that we set aside a very particular point in our lives to really go deeply. I mean, you could think about it as almost like a war. If you fight every day, you're going to die. You can only take so much. But when you go into battle, it's a very, it's a very special kind of thing in a way. It's a very particular time and place, and you have to prepare yourself for that. And you really have to. There has to be a reason why you're entering that space, and usually that's coming from a very deep desire to change oneself, to grow, to evolve. So it's a very special place, and that ceremony kind of creates an environment which allows people to go very deeply. There's often a very long preparation for the ceremony. There's certain rules and things that one needs to avoid, and so you're really preparing yourself for this specific time and place. And then again, always this work was done by people who really have a deep knowledge of it. With Shipibo, part of that story, which I guess I didn't talk about, was kind of the first 3 levels of curanderos who arrived, of doctors. But essentially the initial ayahuasca, that story, those 3 children were the first 3 curanderos. They began to develop a knowledge of this plant. And there's different ways of working with it, but essentially their role was to cure. They were doctors, they were healers. And that one didn't just take the plant like ayahuasca by oneself. One worked with someone who, in Shipibo, it's called an onaya, one who knows, one who has wisdom, one who has done that work deeply themselves and knows how to navigate that space. They know the dose, they know how to prepare the medicine, they know when to pick it, they know where to get it from, they know the exact proportions, they know how to crush it, how to blend it, how much water to use. what songs they sing to it, how to smoke with it. There's so many details, and all of those things are very important. Um, and then in the ceremony space, again, we are opening ourselves very much. And so to really have someone, to have a very skilled doctor to know how to help to guide you through that experience.
Mm.
So yeah, all of those things are really vital. These plants were always worked with in a very sacred way, which again may be a word that's kind of strange to people.
Mm.
But that's also, I think, some of the disconnect that's causing a lot of our suffering too, is so many of us, we've removed ourselves from the sacred, from the ritual, from the ceremony.
Mhm.
And it was something that was so common in cultures all throughout the world: a coming of age ceremony, a
Yeah.
vision quest, doing a dieta, doing something that really kind of shakes us out of our normal way of being, and really enters us into this almost life or death state where we really learn in that way. Because the stakes are so high that everything is seen for what it is. And when one emerges from that experience, one has, in a sense, knowledge or wisdom, and there's a peace, there's a clarity, there's an understanding, a seeing things from a different way, that hopefully leaves us much better.
Mm. Yes, I like that very much. Kind of like a cleansing the mirror of perception. Yeah, I really
Mm.
like something that I think we can kind of flesh out a little bit more about this idea of being opened up to things that you may not be prepared for. And as you know now, that the terminology that's being used now for so much of suffering is trauma, collective trauma. And trauma essentially is when something happens that you're not prepared for. We don't have the resources to deal with it, you're not attended to, and then something is frozen in time in the system. And then that part is, suppressed, numbed, run away from, what everything that we do as humans so that we don't have to experience that again. And I see in my work, and so much with people that, I know who have been to different places to experience ayahuasca, is that is what gets opened up often, is these early places of trauma. And when I met ayahuasca, I think of her, over time I began to think of her as the dark mother of the jungle, but not like in a in a darkness as a wrong thing, but in the sense that like a mother that holds you, and can walk you through these dark places that scare us, these places of fear, and really being able to hold us in that. And why the container and the ritual and the ceremony is so important, because when you can really relax in that, a very deep healing and integration can take place. So I want to hear you say more about the preparation, being prepared, readiness and being held in safety. And, for me, this is like so essential. And you also spoke about purging. And I, in fact, love purging and know that it happens in so many different ways. I work as a therapist, and when a person can, come to a place of release and come out of the mind and the talk and the narrative and actually have the experience of feeling whatever they haven't been able to feel, and come out of that holding and resisting and numbness, it's just so beautiful to behold. And I think that this is like one of the greatest capacities and potentials of being able to connect to those places and let them open and heal.
Yeah, well, you mentioned this idea of trauma, and that's a very common phenomena. Um, I mean, having worked with a lot of people now, one of the one of the really common things that everyone deals with is this sense of kind of, no one understands me, no one understands my suffering. The kind of, and it's natural that the world revolves around me, because in a sense it has to. Who else would it revolve around? But with that also comes a lot of pain. And something I've seen now through working with so many people is, I mean, there's people who've had some really horrific pasts. I mean, I think things that most of us couldn't even imagine. Uh, so there's all sorts of different levels of trauma. There's very acute trauma where maybe we can point to it, and then there's all sorts of just very subtle trauma. Maybe a word someone said, something someone did, and these things can begin to accumulate over time. And in Spanish they would often call it susto, or in Shipibo they call it, I believe, ratu. And it's something everyone has. Everyone has some form of susto, some form of trauma. It's part of being a human being. Nobody has a perfectly harmonious life. And that's actually not something to be desired for, even, because there would be no growth, there would be no evolution. These things are actually necessary to the human being. But at some point, that trauma can build up, and then it creates an unhealthy imbalance. And so it's about bringing the human organism back into balance. So with many of these systems, like the Shipibo, really what they're trying to do, from my point of view, is they're trying to bring the human organism back into balance. And that may be clearing the trauma. That may be really, especially in the beginning, as you said, this idea of purging. It can be a lot of purging. It's a lot of cleaning. It's a lot of clearing. It's kind of trying to free ourselves of these heavy layers that could be trauma. A lot of it is beliefs. Those are huge things that we have to clear. I know I am right. This person is wrong. I'm the good guy. They're the bad guy. And it's very, again, self-centered. It's that I think I'm right. I'm holding on to these things, but these things that I'm holding on to, they eventually become a cage that keeps me trapped. And that's how I see the world, is through this lens. And in Vedic terminology, it would be, I see the world through Maya. I'm seeing everything through this veil. And I find etymology really fascinating, but even this Christian ideal of apocalypse, it's often this we have this false notion of it, that it's the end of the world, but that's actually not what apocalypse means. It means the lifting of the veil. It means seeing things how they actually are. Very common Eastern practice, something like Vipassana, means the same thing, seeing things how they actually are. Because all of us, we don't see that way. We see things through this veil that we've created through our life experiences. And so a lot of the early work is really trying to clean and clear that, to really, just like if you were trying to clean a house, it's not going to help to polish something if there's dust everywhere, if there's garbage everywhere. First, you have to really clean that up, get the house in order, and then you can begin to fine tune things. So that process of purging is huge. That's one of the fundamental principles of ayahuasca. In Spanish, a lot of times people refer to ayahuasca as la purga, which means the purge. And many people would say that's the primary goal of ayahuasca, is simply to purge us, that it's this idea that we're just constantly purging, we're constantly releasing. With each purge, whether that's a vomit or crying or laughing or having some amazing experience, it's freeing us, it's letting something go. And so sometimes people have heard of this analogy of an onion. It's like peeling away the layers of the onion. So it's not necessarily that we're taking on more, we're gaining things by working with ayahuasca. It's actually the opposite. It's a process of purging, of letting go. In India, there you hear a lot this process called neti, which means not this, not this. And it's a similar thing. It's letting each of these layers go. That's not who I am. That's not who I am. That's not who I am. And that's also why ayahuasca, one of the Quechua translations of it, is Vine of the Dead, because essentially that's what it's doing. Is it's each time we drink, it's a process of dying. It's a process of one of these layers is dying away, and with each layer, we get closer and closer to the essence of who we are, which is one of the other translations of ayahuasca, which is a Quechua word, which is vine of the soul, that actually it's getting us closer and closer to this essence of who we actually are. So yes, that process of purging is vital, and it's something I think that really separates a plant like ayahuasca from other plants that may just be specifically visionary. And there can be a tremendous power and things we can learn through the visionary experience. But for a lot of these traditional groups like the Shipibo, they see that even more of the power actually comes from the purge, and that the more we purge ourselves, the more open we are to these other ways of being, these other realms, being able to work in different ways, and ultimately just being ourselves, being peaceful, being happy, feeling connected. So yeah, that's the purge.
Yeah, I think that one big purge too that I've seen from a lot of people, myself included, early on, was the purge of fatigue. Just the way that our Western culture and other cultures as well, where there can be this so much to keep up with, like we can get entrained to kind of keep up with this modern way of living and technology and busyness, where we don't have enough time to even assimilate or digest as much as we're getting bombarded with. And it's almost like we can, easily become so distracted by things that just aren't necessary. And, I feel just like a spiritual practice or the practice of working with anything that is, focuses on what's truly important in life, it starts to kind of clear away these non-essentials, in these ways in which we get consumed, and become consumers. I recently watched this Netflix documentary, which was it? It was about the internet.
Social dilemma.
Social dilemma, and how we're the product. And it was so good. I think everybody should see it. But I mean, it has become stronger and stronger and stronger. And in a sense, we're really being called and asked to remember what's important. And so I was speaking of the purge of fatigue, and I find that a lot just when people show up on a retreat or just show up on the pillow to meditate or do yoga or whatever. Like in the beginning, initially for some people, they can't even keep their eyes open because there's so much fatigue. And that's one of the purges. It's, that purging of fatigue, of efforting, of striving, of struggling, of getting somewhere, of getting it right. There's so much of that where we form an identity around that. And then this loosening of the gripping of the identity, how that can fall away and fall away and fall away as not necessary. Excuse my throat, it's just still the smoke is clearing in the air and it's really got me. But I too, I love the purge. I mean, and to see it and then to see what happens for people. And also there's challenge in that. There's this challenge that gets presented when you say for people to kind of really show up for yourself, to kind of like place yourself in front of this master teacher, because there's no escape. Once you ingest the dose, you can't give it back. There you are, the teacher is in you, and call it she or he. There you are, it's a full encounter. And, I want to hear more about, let's just speak about, at a certain point, there can be great challenge in that, to stay with it. And that's, again, where the sense of feeling contained and safe, and that you have medicos that are there with you, that know what they're doing, and have this wisdom from their lineage to bring forward. Yeah, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the the fatigue is a huge thing. It's in traditional Chinese medicine terms, I think they call it Jing, and it's like this vital life force that we all have, and many of us were depleted of that through lifestyle choices, through poor diet, through maybe not enough exercise, but a lot is through mental patterns, through being overwhelmed with things by again these beliefs that we have. And it's something that a lot of these plant medicines have access to help us to purge from. One that's very powerful for that is actually called iboga, and it's, from the plants I've worked with, it was the strongest to really show, and it's a very common experience of all of these mental thought patterns that we have that are just running in the background 24/7 for years, decades, maybe since childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And they take a toll because that's energy, and it's constantly there, looping, churning, moving, and that depletes us of this vital energy. And so we're left, there's only so much energy we have, and if it's being expended upon all of these different things, we're going to be depleted. Absolutely. And that's one of the things that these plants have a power of, is to help to free ourselves of those, so that we can actually get back to that essential life force. As you were saying about the difficulty, 100%. It's this work is not easy. It's, I think it's one of the things, it's very interesting how we think about things like medicine or drugs or recreational drugs. We all have different ways of thinking about that, and different beliefs. But I think one of the things that really separates what we would call these master plants is, in general, they're not taken for pleasure. I mean, it's maybe in the beginning, again, there can be these amazing experiences and just really incredible things. But eventually there's purging, there's cleansing, and that can be very uncomfortable. It can be physically painful. And ultimately, as you begin to move up kind of the layers, you're getting to mental purges, towards emotional purges, and eventually this idea of spirit, of connection, of oneness.
Mm-hmm.
And the deeper one goes down kind of that rabbit hole of working with these plants, it's kind of counterintuitive from my experience of what many people would think, which is many people think that the more you work with them, the easier it would become. But from my experience, it's actually the opposite, because we're getting closer and closer to death, which again is why something like ayahuasca is called Vine of the Dead.
Mm.
And the closer we get to that, the bigger the challenge is, because it may be in the beginning, again, we have to clear away these heavy things. Maybe I'm angry at someone, and I see it from the other side, and then I can release that, and then I'm free of that.
Mm-hmm.
But as we get to these more fundamental things, these ideas of who I am, the nature of reality, when those begin to fall away, I just interviewed a friend of mine named Felix, and he was saying it too. It becomes terrifying. It's terrifying to truly to let go of everything, to even let go of the sense of who I am, to let go of my body, to let go of my consciousness, to let go of anything that I can hold on to let go of the ground, of the earth, of the air.
Mm.
It's unfathomable, and it takes a tremendous courage to do this work. And it's often said that these plants like ayahuasca, they always give us what they need, and they never give us more than we can handle. So you mentioned in the beginning this idea of an intelligence, and I think when people do begin to work with these plants, they almost universally come to that experiential conclusion that there's some intelligence at work, and people have different ways of describing that, but that essentially these plants, they're trying to help us, and they're giving us what we need. But that's not necessarily, almost assuredly, it's not what we want. Because if we think we already know, if we think, this is the thing I want or I need, and if I just get that, I'll be happy, that's actually the root of a lot of our suffering, is it's coming from this mind place of thinking that I know. And the real scary part of it, again, is when we understand that we don't. And that really takes a leap of faith. It takes courage, as you said, to go into the darkness, to not know, to not understand, to let go of these things that give us our sense of self. So yeah, this work takes a lot of courage. It takes a real desire. One has to want to do this work. Um, it's a really common experience we talk about when we're talking about integration, which is you can't become an ayahuasca evangelist because it's just never going to work.
Yeah.
It's one of the things about Santo Daime. You can't tell someone they need to drink ayahuasca and expect them to show up, drink, and everything's going to be fine. No, they're going to get taken into a very difficult place, and unless you really want to go there, unless the stakes are high and you have some deep desire of whether it's suffering or something you want to get rid of, or this deep quest to understand yourself, the experience is probably going to be too difficult, and you run away. So it takes a desire, and as you were saying, because we can go so deep, it's again very important to be working with people who know how to help to guide that space. Like anything, I mean, one of the more difficult experiences that people will often have when they go deep into this work is they literally think they're going crazy. They're losing their mind.
Yes.
And it's funny because there's this joke that in the East or in India, if you say you're losing your mind, people are like, wow, and they bow down to you and they're like, how did you do that? Teach me. But in the West, if we say we're losing our mind, they give you the number of a psychiatrist and say, better go to this person. But I think a lot of us have this idea. It's this very common idea that I want to lose my mind, or I want to lose my ego. I want to be free of my ego.
Mm-hmm.
Very few people are really ready to do that, because you are losing your mind, and that is a scary thing. That's a state of psychosis. And to be in that state, it's very important to have support there, to have people who maybe know how to bring the effect down a bit, or to even just to talk to you, to help you to navigate that space. It's so important. And yeah.
Yeah. It seems like working with all of these master plants, you're making a distinction between a master plant and I think maybe other psychedelics, or I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. But
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of people would say, I did a podcast, if anyone's interested, with a guy named Claude, and this tradition I
is
mentioned
that
called the two.
the one with San Pedro speaking about, or no?
That was a different one. Yeah. This guy, he's an anthropologist. He worked at the temple for a long time. He still does. But he studied a lot of these cultures very deeply. But if anyone's interested, he talks about this medicine canoe, and that all of these master plants came on this medicine
Oh
canoe.
yes.
And,
Mm-hmm.
and that essentially there are these plants that were given to humans by God, by spirit, by the creator, to allow humans to know, to understand, to reconnect, to remember their source. Um, and interestingly, the first plant in that canoe is actually tobacco, and you hear that in a number of traditions, that tobacco was the first plant given to humans so that they could dream like the creator dreamt the universe into creation, which is quite beautiful.
Mm.
But it's the sense that these master plants they're connecting us in a way that other plants don't have the ability to. All plants are medicine. And even probably a lot of people don't realize that most pharmaceutical medicine, it's less and less, but still probably at least half or more is plant derived. So
Yeah.
even most of the pharmaceutical medicine we're taking is plant derived. They begin to synthesize it more and more, and but essentially all medicine since the dawn of time was plants. So even something like basil is medicine, oregano is medicine, thyme is medicine,
Yeah.
but they wouldn't necessarily be called a master plant. They're medicine in that they have the ability to alter us, to heal us, to help us, to nourish us. But there's these kind of specific group of a number of master plants that have the ability really to work on all of the different layers of the human being.
Beautiful.